Today on The Global African, we'll examine the recent elections that took place in Tunisia in North Africa and whether they represent a continuation of the legacy of the Tunisian revolution. There's a huge struggle currently underway to keep the internet free and open. A mass movement has coalesced around a principle known as net neutrality. That's today on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. While much of the media's Arab Spring coverage focused on Egypt, it was the Tunisian revolution that lit the initial fire of insurrection against the region's oppressive regimes. The people of Tunisia took to the streets to demand regime change, eventually ousting then-President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. An interim body drafted a new constitution, laying the groundwork for a functioning democratic process. Tunisians flocked to the polls. 5 million Tunisians became eligible to vote in the election, making this a proud moment in the quest for freedom and democracy in a nation that had long been saddled with tyranny and oppression. And joining us is Professor R.A. Judy, who's a professor of critical and cultural studies at the University of Pittsburgh, a member of the Boundary 2 editorial collective, a Fulbright fellow at the Institut Bourguiba des Langues Vivantes from 1998 to 1999. He's edited two important Boundary 2 dossiers on Tunisia, one entitled Tunisia, Some Notes on the Status of Global English in Tunisia, and the other, The Tunisian Revolution, Dignity. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill, for having me.
So you've just returned recently from Tunisia. So tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about the situation. There had been an expectation in much of the mainstream media in the United States that the Islamist party, the Ennahda, would win, but the elections turned out differently.
Well, yes, no surprise to anyone on the ground in Tunisia or anyone who's a careful follower of Tunisia. And in fact, the way that the election turned out, and it was an interesting turnout. There was a 62% turnout across all the districts, which was remarkable. And in some of the main centers, like the capital, as high as 70%, and some other areas, like Arus, even higher. So there was a full turnout. And in that turnout, even though Nahda was well organized, the majority of the vote clearly was a rejection of the Nahda. We see the results in Nahda Tunis, which of course is the coalition that includes Bourguibaist and members of the former ruling party, the RCD-SCD, as well as other liberal elements, all of whom are secular. And Nahda Tunis is fundamentally a center-right party.
Let's just go back for a second. Tunisia was the site of the beginning of what came to be known as the Arab Spring. In other countries where uprisings emerged, very different results, whether we're talking about Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria. What is it about Tunisia? What has happened in Tunisia that even though there have been extremist Salafist forces, there seems to be a larger scale commitment to a transformation? Or am I misreading it?
No, but this is the million-dollar question. There are a number of variables that may be contributing to Tunisia's distinctiveness. Of course, the uprising in Tunisia was a spontaneous uprising in the streets that was led by the educated youth. You need to keep in mind that youth between the ages of 18 and 25, 70% of them have post-secondary education. It's one of the most educated populations in the region, and these are the ones who began the revolution, beginning with Bouazizi, who of course burned himself and became the symbol of the revolution. But in addition to that, there has been an ongoing, really semi-autonomous, and I'll explain what I mean by semi-autonomous in a minute, union movement in the UGTT, the
General Union of Tunisian Workers.
That has always maintained a kind of distance from the government. There have been elements in it that are leaning towards the government, and we know up to the revolution that, of course, Ben Ali's government had incorporated or absorbed, if you will, corrupted the leadership, but the rank and file supported the revolution. And the semi-autonomy of that movement going back to independence enabled it to play a major role in consolidating secular opposition to the Nahda government in a very pivotal role after Bil'Aid had been assassinated by Salafists. So the power of the union and its organizing strengths has played a key role. Now, we have to be careful, of course, because the union is indeed an institution, and it's right now well positioned in a role of being sort of kingmaker.
What are the Salafists doing now while this is going on?
Well, we have to make a distinction between the Salafists, the Salafiyun, and Nahda. Nahda being, of course, the political party, the Salafists being those we associate with terrorism, and in fact, they have been trying to wage a military war against the state on the Algerian border and are very well contained. And I'm sure your viewers are aware of, because the New York Times just covered it belatedly, the fact that only a few days before the October 26th election, there was a gunfight involving some Salafists just outside of the capital. By and large, though, they're contained. They pose no real threat. Al-Mursi's Center for Crisis Analysis just released in October his report showing that Tunisia shows a promise for stability in terms of security in the region as far as containing the Salafists. Now, that has its own issues about the emergence of a certain kind of security state. But what it does mean is that the Salafists pose no real threat or danger to the state inventing itself as a kind of democratic order.
Has the process that we've been watching in Tunisia, is it accurately described as a revolution?
You know, that's when I was in Tunisia for 10 days in October and November. This was one of the issues that we were exploring both with the leadership of the UGTT, as well as in conversation with the leadership of the Popular Front and at two academic events at Manuba and Manar. And this is really a burning question. Is it a revolution? What is revolution? One Uruguayan poet put it recently that the revolution is like a violin, right? Built by the left and played by the right. And you know, that's some of that is the concern about the way in which the electoral process has resulted in the end with two rightist parties having the majority of seats, Nada Tunis and the Nahda. But the fact that the Popular Front was able to bring in 6.91% of the vote and achieve 15 seats, only one seat less than the Free Patriotic Union, indicates there's still a great deal of if you will, the fervor of the streets.
Professor Ari Judy, thank you very, very much. There's a huge struggle currently underway to keep the internet free and open. A mass movement has coalesced around a principle known as net neutrality, which demands that the internet be classified by the Federal Communications Commission as a public utility. In this segment, we'll take a look at net neutrality and what it means for communities of color all across the United States. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The internet has become an essential tool in our lives. We use it to communicate with friends and family, to find and share information, to get access to goods and services, to find jobs, to report news, and to organize around important causes. But the internet as we know it today could be a very different landscape in the years ahead if major telecommunications and cable companies like Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, and Time Warner are allowed to dominate the internet. In a digital age, the internet is the prime mover of information and publisher of diverse voices. In social, civic, political, and economic spheres, our scale of awareness, our relevance and impact depend on access to an open internet. Without equal and open access, people will have a much harder time interacting and organizing or sustaining movements with the same grassroots power or in the same spontaneous way that we know today. Media justice activists argue that if we lose net neutrality, we will lose the internet as we know it, and that will hurt those who are most vulnerable and who won't be able to afford access. That is why they view net neutrality as a fundamental issue. Net neutrality essentially means that the service providers can't control content and that all people have equal access to it. Joining us are two leaders of the net neutrality movement in the United States. We have Malkia Cyril, who's the executive director of the Center for Media Justice, and Alex Nogales, who's the CEO of the National Hispanic Media Coalition. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a very basic question. We hear a lot about this thing called net neutrality. I have found that a lot of people have not a clue as to what that is. Malkia, could you just give us a basic understanding of what this is?
Well, yeah, I think, the easiest way to understand it, and I'd love to hear what Alex thinks about this too, is it's the protection of free speech online. There are rules that ensure that internet service providers can't block or discriminate against your content, no matter no matter what that content is. And I would say the other way to understand it is that net neutrality rules, or the principle of net neutrality and non-discrimination, has guided the internet since its inception. It's why the internet has been able to grow and be such an innovative force for democracy in this country. A DC Circuit Court struck down net neutrality last year, and the Federal Communications Commission is right now trying to figure out what rules it's going to pass. And as of this very moment, the FCC is considering passing rules that it would in fact allow discrimination online, thereby changing the nature of the internet as it's been for decades now. So that's the danger.
Alex, who are the forces that are at war on this issue?
Well, it is the people that provide the services of the ISPs, the internet service providers. But let me add to what Malkia just said, and only because we've got to understand it in very other terms as well. We were a couple of days ago with Senator Markey. He's one of our champions, as you may know, in terms of the internet. He has been involved with this issue since 1993, when he had a bill talking about these kinds of things. In any case, he said, net neutrality is no discrimination over the internet. And what we cannot have is two tiers: people that pay a higher price to have complete access and complete wonderful speed over the internet, while the rest of us that cannot afford it are discriminated against and even blocked because of the fact that we're not paying the big dollars. So I understand it that way. I understand it as well as a civil rights issue. Absolutely. It is like being able or not being able to vote. It is exactly the same type of situation. If you're not connected to the world, you're not connected to the nation, you're not hearing what your community can say or is saying about this or that issue. So the ramifications of net neutrality, as Akia pointed out, are tremendous. It is a difference between the haves and the have-nots. And that offers a bleak future for all of us if, in fact, all of us have access with high speeds, with low costs for everyone.
Malkia, there seems to be a struggle going on within the Obama administration on this. On the one hand, we have President Obama saying that he's in favor of net neutrality. On the other hand, we have FCC Chair Wheeler, who seems a bit more ambiguous. How would you sum this up?
I would sum it up in two ways. Okay, so the first way is this. Let's be clear that this is a battle between two parts of the ruling class. And on the one side, if we get net neutrality, on the short term, it will support democracy for the rest of us. That is what will happen. But in the long term, there's still going to be more needed, right? There's still going to be more organizing needed. So when we talk about the relationship or the distinction between what President Obama is talking about and what Wheeler is talking about, first, let's understand that these are two members of the ruling class that are arguing about a principle. So that's first. The second part, though, is that we really need to understand that what President Obama has come out and said is very clear, that in order to continue to build on any principle of democracy, any principle of non-discrimination, any principle emerging from the civil rights movement, you must have a neutral network over which to debate those issues. And President Obama has said very clearly the only way to achieve a democratic media platform like the internet, to continue to have that, is through not only net neutrality rules, but net neutrality rules that are grounded in Title II. Title II means that the internet is considered a common carrier, just like the phone, right? So you have to have both of these elements in order to keep the internet non-discriminatory. That's what President Obama is saying.
Just explain this common carrier thing. What exactly is that? What does that refer to?
Okay, great. And I'll get let me finish that sentence, and then I'll explain what a common carrier is. So that's on the one hand, President Obama is saying you must have these two elements in order to keep the internet non-discriminatory. On the other hand, you have basically a cable lobbyist who is running the Federal Communications Commission. Mm-hmm. And that cable lobbyist, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, instead of wanting to ground non-discrimination rules in a larger regulation, Title II, which would make broadband like the telephone, right? It would mean that broadband is considered a utility, a public utility, just like the telephone. And the reason for that is that broadband is ubiquitous. It is now necessary for basic life. It is necessary to pay your bills. It is necessary to talk on the phone. It is necessary to watch the news, to consume news. It is necessary to manage your immigration status. It is necessary to manage your probation. It is necessary on every level. People have to use the internet to navigate democracy. And so when a media platform becomes that necessary, becomes that central to daily life, it must be treated like a public utility, like electricity, like water, like the telephone. And so those are basically, on the one hand, you have Wheeler who's saying, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, who's saying, no, I do not want to treat the internet like a public utility. No, I do not want to protect it with the strongest network neutrality rules possible. What I want to do is allow ISPs to continue to make tons of money because that's the only way they'll continue to innovate. And then you have President Obama standing with 4 million other people in this country saying, actually, a DC Circuit Court said you can't make it non-discriminatory unless you ground it in Title II. So these are the sides on this issue. And then in the middle, in between these two members of the ruling class debating this issue, you have millions of poor people, millions of working people, millions of Black people, millions of migrants, just millions and millions of people who are saying, you know what, we want a democratic platform, period. We want a democratic platform. We want it to be treated like a public utility. That's what we want. And we need our elected and appointed officials to listen.
Is corporate America divided on this question, or are they pretty much united on one side or the other?
It's a money thing. If in fact it's going to affect your business, if you're going to have to pay higher rates that Netflix was paying Comcast, you're not going to like this very much, okay? Because they're going to be paying huge numbers of dollars to be on the air to put out their programming. And let us be clear, Tom Wheeler is not a bad guy, but the industry is working him over like you cannot believe. And we were just with some of our congressional people a couple of days ago, and the same thing. They're not taking a position, not because they don't understand the issues involved, but because Verizon, AT&T, and the other ISPs are just working them day in and day out and telling them we won't be able to do some of the programs that we're having to make sure that people have broadband access. We won't be able to to do all these build-outs that'll be necessary to bring everybody into the party. So, they're not bad people. They're just being worked over with a lot of dollars. And that's terrible, but that's the reality of the situation.
Let me pursue that.
One thing I'd add to that is to say there actually are multiple camps of corporations here. You have Netflix and Tumblr and Etsy and all of the companies that actually were born online saying, actually, we want Title II. We want net neutrality because we want the next Etsy. We want the next Facebook. We want the next, Twitter to be able to emerge. And those people who started those things were just regular. Well, they weren't just regular people. Many of them actually were part of the upper class originally. But the point is that no innovation can come from everyday people without Title II and net neutrality. And so those companies want it. They have advocated for it very strongly. But incumbent companies like AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, Comcast, they are against it because it will, in fact, force them to pay their fair share, and they don't want to.
Alex, pretend, as Denzel Washington said in Philadelphia, I'm 6 years old. So I want you to explain to me, if we lose net neutrality, for a regular person, what difference is it going to make in their lives? How will they feel it?
It's interesting you should even say this because I just got an email from a fellow who runs a nonprofit organization. It's called Somos. And what he does is laudable. It's such a wonderful program. He teaches young kids how to write. And, being able to write is very important because you can talk about your experiences and those things about you that influence your thinking, that influence the way that you are. And then he goes on to the juniors, the teenagers, and he goes on as well to adults. He's teaching them how to write and how to monetize all this. Now, to do it, he uses the internet. He uses the internet to put out their work. If, in fact, net neutrality under Title II does not occur, what is going to happen is that he's out of business. He won't be able to afford the higher speeds, the speeds necessary to put out this wonderful work that those kids are doing, that adults are doing. So that's how it's going to affect us on a very personal level. Here in California, our kids are going to be, before too much longer, tested on their skills on the internet. Now, how can you test kids on their skills on the internet if, in fact, they don't even have it?
Right.
And the numbers are terrible for Latinos. A little bit under 50% of Latino kids do not have access to the internet at home. And that's a terrible situation because that means they're going to be deprived of a good education. They're going to be deprived of knowing what is going on in the world around them.
Thank you both very much for taking this time with us to explain this issue. And over the next several weeks, I'm assuming that this is going to be playing out and becoming even more heated. So thank you very much for joining us for The Global African.
Thank you very much for having us.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll see you next time.